Welcome back. Well, we're continuing to look ahead to this afternoon's emergency budget by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Let me take you back now to Auckland Park. It's where we find my colleague Arabile Gumede. Arabile, a very good morning to you.
It's a good morning to you, Blaine. Look, it certainly is an interesting time when one takes a look at the supplementary budget, which has been necessitated, of course, by the COVID-19 crisis. South Africa has had to put through a 500 billion rand stimulus or relief package, really, that is aimed at trying to help consumers, help small businesses, as well as all those that kind of need the money. Even those that are unemployed, of course, receiving some sort of benefit. The big issue is exactly where does the 130 billion rand get reprioritized from when it comes to the certain departments. The other element is that 370 billion rand of the 500 billion, where exactly does that come from? What are the ratios within which that money will come from exactly? And where to when it goes to spending? It's unlikely that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni will induce or create more tax revenue in the form of higher tax income, but unfortunately that may something he may allude to for February. So big questions on that front there. But very quickly, let's have a conversation about this, Blaine. Kwaku Koratang is from Absa and he joins us now. Kwaku, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Look, it certainly is an unprecedented budget, and we've said that word more times than we probably have in terms of the money we have, even in our bank accounts now. Would you say then that it's the most unprecedented budget, but at the same time, a budget that South Africa needs to get right?
It definitely is. I mean, if you remember, back in February, the budget was actually quite, dramatic. There was a lot of negative news about it. The deficits had widened, quite significantly. And this was just a few weeks before Corona started, picking up pace. And as a result of that, we had to, implement all these measures. So it definitely is the most unique type of budget that we've had to, announce. And other countries are going through quite a similar, experience, because these are unprecedented times from a financial, fiscal, and economic perspective.
What's your biggest expectation then with regards to what he may really announce? What's the one thing you're looking at and saying he needs to make changes here 100% for sure? I mean, we know it has to be a wholesale change, but the biggest standing point for you?
So if you've, monitored his comments over the last few weeks, he has been, for instance, talking about things like, zero-based budgeting. So rather than creating a budget where you build up from, previous years, he has been talking about the fact that given where we are now, given the difficult, fiscal situation and the challenges that COVID presents, we actually need to look at, the country's needs from scratch and then allocate budgets around that. So it will be quite interesting to hear what comments he has to, make around that. And there are, some discerning voices around that, type of approach. And then another thing to look out for is just, their forecast in terms of tax revenue. What are they projecting in terms of, the whole, you're hearing at numbers that are close to about 300 billion. So all of those things are quite challenging. And then the other aspect to consider is that when COVID and lockdowns started, the economic growth forecasts were expected to be about -6%, for 2020. And of late, you are seeing numbers that vary from, let's say, 8 to even up to a 20% shrinkage in the economy. So the scope of the challenges that we face are quite significant. And I think a lot of the numbers have deteriorated a lot more than was anticipated in, March.
Do you think we're going to need to get even more funding from, foreign sources? As of now, a lot of our capital markets, investments sort of into South Africa are really from local investors, which has been a sense of pride, if you want to call it that. The remaining 10%, however, has been from foreign markets. Do you see us tapping into that a little bit more in order to be able to fund our budget in future?
Yeah, we definitely will have to, tap into foreign markets. I mean, And in addition to that, you can see that, globally, interest rates are actually close to about, 0%. So despite recent downgrades and, the prospects for debt costs to increase, we will definitely have to tap domestic markets, for some relief. And then there's also been a lot of, commentary around potential IMF programs. I mean, at the budget, it was anticipated that, the next the debt to GDP would probably be about 68%. But given what COVID has done, that number is now expected to increase to over 80. And then over a 5-year period, I mean, the finance minister has said that our debt to GDP could be over 100%. So when you look at all those dynamics, it does suggest that there is, quite a high likelihood that we will have to approach some of these, institutions, despite the fact that historically we have, shied away from that.
Yeah. Let's explain a little bit more with regards to that debt to GDP ratio being at around 100% in about 3 years' time, which is in around 2024, is what the finance minister has suggested. Look, it could, of course, be sooner if things spiral out of control and continue on this downward trajectory. But if we reach 100% of GDP, what does that actually mean for an economy like South Africa that is said to be, of course, an emerging market, but also an economy that hasn't recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, technically, even though we were better standing at that time as well?
Yeah, so one has to look at that in the global context because COVID is impacting all countries in a similar way. So you will see that, debt to GDP across the world will definitely shift quite dramatically in a negative direction. But South Africa has been looking quite vulnerable, over the last decade. And it's often thought that once, your debt to GDP starts to exceed 60, 70% for an emerging market, you run the risks of, getting into some kind of a debt trap. So if you look at the last 3 to 4 years, the debt costs have actually been by far the fastest rising part of, our local fiscal expenditure. So if debt to GDP has moved from, let's say, 5 years ago when, it was just over 50%, and we are anticipating that it's going to reach 100% in about 3 to 5 years, it just gives you a sense of the amount of the budget that, interest payments will now start to, constitute, which then means that there'll be some challenges in terms of expenditure in other sectors of, the economy.
All right. Do you think the zero-basing budget idea from the finance minister is perhaps a good one at this point? Is it something feasible and plausible for the country as well?
We are running out of choices in terms of, whether we accept it or not. So the zero-based budgeting will be uncomfortable because it's quite a dramatic shift to how, the budget and planning has been, implemented since 94, 95. But we are heading in a direction where those type of discussions are inevitable in terms of, trying to change the direction. So it will definitely be uncomfortable. I mean, it has significant implications on, the various departments if that was implemented. But it is an opportune time to, look at zero-based budgeting because historically it has been thought that perhaps we need to further optimize how the country's, finances are spent. There are some areas of inefficiencies. And in addition to that, in a time like this, you need to prioritize your spending in terms of what's urgent, what's not urgent, what's critical. And those are some of the considerations that, need to be taken into account. But it definitely is on the table in terms of, the way we should progress going forward.
Yeah. Just a very final question there. That growth figure is one we've continuously spoken about, but yesterday we saw the jobs numbers, and having this budget on the back of those jobs numbers is bound to hurt and bound to tell you a bad story. If we just look at the United States, they've lost at least 10% when it comes to their unemployment figures, going from around 4% now to around 14% or so for their unemployment. If we were to sit in just the exact same situation, it could be worse, of course, we would then head up to 40%. Is that possible?
So it definitely is possible. And in fact, given how things are progressing, 40% almost seems like, it could be quite optimistic, because if you look at the American economy, I mean, it was running at quite full steam. You had full unemployment. They didn't have as many vulnerabilities to the economy that we had. So going into lockdown, the economy was extremely fragile. And at this point in time, things have obviously, worsened. So based on your calculations in terms of how the US unemployment rate has moved, it's very plausible that, we could have a similar or even bigger impact in South Africa. And remember that although our unemployment rate is close to about 30%, there are in some circles where people are of the belief that it's actually, higher, just given how employment is actually measured. So if you look at the youth, for instance, it's often said that, youth unemployment is over 50%. So the combination of those dynamics pose very, very serious challenges from an employment situation. And then already we are seeing signs of that. So for instance, if you look at the tourism sector, if you look at the hospitality sector, if you look at sectors such as, restaurants, etc., if there aren't dramatic improvements in the economy over the next couple of weeks or months, there's just no way those type of industries will survive this. So definitely challenging negative scenario for, the expected unemployment rates.
Yeah, Kwaku Koratang, thank you so much. Appreciate the time, but we'll certainly be watching at 3 p.m. Hopefully we can have a chat afterwards and see whether the outcomes are certainly in line with some of the prospects and projections that we have put forward as well here. Kwaku Koratang is from Absa, and he helped us unpack that. Of course, that budget speech does happen in a few hours' time from now. Taking a look at the time, it's nearly 11 o'clock. So 3 p.m. is when that happens. So 4 hours to go. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni said to deliver that budget, of course, via a webinar, that is. So technology playing its part in the time of COVID-19. I hand back to Blaine right after the short break. Do stay tuned. Of course, we'll continue to give you coverage across the day when it comes to that budget speech. Stay tuned.